Greetings all, FerrariMan601 here. RaceSim Studio were the first guys to release a realistic 2017 spec Formula 1 car. They were the first team to release a car such as that for Assetto Corsa, and we all know and love that as the 2017 Formula Hybrid. They released that car at the end of the winter test period before the current Formula 1 season, and my god, that is one of the best cars in Assetto Corsa, vanilla content or mod content. Absolutely staggering effort RaceSim Studio managed to pull off on Formula Hybrid. The RSS guys, a small team based out of Spain, headed up by David Dominguez, they are not sitting still, however. Last week, they gave us this, their second large-scale Assetto Corsa mod release, Formula RSS 2. This car is fictional, however it is very heavily modeled after the Dallara GP211, which is the car in the single-spec Formula 2 racing series. Formula 2, in previous years it was known as GP2, it is a single-spec formula and it is the primary feeder series for Formula 1. The Dallara GP211, it features a 4-liter V8 engine. The engine puts out about 612 horsepower at 10,000 RPM, and more or less the car is dimensionally identical to a 2010 through 2013 spec Formula 1 car. Of course, Formula 1 switched over to the hybrid powertrains beginning in 2014, and in 2017, Formula 1 began a completely new revamp of the technical regulations when it comes to car dimensions and, of course, aerodynamics, which now means that this car looks a little bit dated in comparison to Formula Hybrid for sure, and, of course, in comparison to the 2017 Formula 1 field. However, GP2, now rebranded as Formula 2 in 2017, has not yet updated. They are scheduled to bring on a new chassis starting next year, 2018. However, GP2, Formula 2, however you're still most comfortable referring to that series, still using this car. In the real world, it is the Dallara GP211. However, due to all sorts of restrictions that we don't have time to go into, RSS RaceSim Studio have branded their iteration of this car Formula RSS 2. And what a car it is. From the RaceSim Studio website, over on their car profile page, the specifications on this car are as follows. The Formula RSS 2 is filled with excitement, quality, and enough power to have enjoyable and competitive races or exhilarating solo practice runs, without the need to conserve or deploy electrical energy like Formula Hybrid 2017, while still having DRS capability. It is the perfect blend of traditional racing and modern technologies. Yes, those of you who are familiar with GP2, aka Formula 2, you will know that in GP2 they do not have the energy recovery systems that we normally associate now with LMP1 and of course Formula 1. However, as it was new to Formula 1 in 2011, the technology of DRS, GP2 Formula 2 also adopted DRS, and of course it is fitted here on the RSS 2. However, this car is essentially a baby Formula 1 car circa 2011, so it's not as powerful as a Formula 1 car, nor is it as fast. In my testing here, some of which you have already seen on the channel, it's about 10 seconds slower than a 2017 Formula 1 car, and by that I'm defining that as RSS Formula Hybrid. About 10 seconds is the delta between this car and Formula Hybrid over the course of a given lap. However, that does not mean by any stretch of the imagination that this car is slow. Although it is down on power in comparison to a Formula 1 car, this thing still packs quite a punch. As I mentioned, we've got about 612 horsepower coming out of a 4-liter V8 engine, normally aspirated of course. It produces that 612 horsepower at an absolutely dizzy 10,000 RPM. Yes, we're used to seeing Formula 1 engines rev well north of 14,000 RPM. In the V8 days, they were redlining at 19,000 and then later 18,000 RPM. Of course, the old V10s were capable of 20,000 on rare occasion. However, 10,000 RPM for a 4-liter engine is pretty staggering, I must say. In the real world, that 4-liter V8 engine is produced by Mechachrome, designed by Renault and marketed and branded as a Renault. However, it's a Mechachrome engine. Remember that name from Formula 1. They ran with teams such as Arrows in the days gone by. However, 612 horsepower out of that engine, and it produces 500 newton meters of torque at 8,000 RPM. So you have a relatively narrow power band in this engine. Yes, it does idle at about 1,500 RPM, as you would expect from a race engine like this, but the max power only really starts to come in north of 7,500 and 8,000 RPM is when you get max torque. Max power comes all the way up at redline at 10,000 RPM, at which point you run into the rev limiter. Transmitting that power for us in this car, we have a 6-speed semi-automatic sequential paddle shift gearbox. This is somewhat old technology. Of course, it has very little in common with road gearboxes. It is a single clutch gearbox, but it is 100% automated in terms of the upshift and downshift. All the driver has to do is pull a paddle. Those of you who are Formula 2 or Formula 1 fans or LMP1 fans or any Le Mans class nowadays, you're well familiar with this technology. Up on the right, down on the left. The shifts are pretty quick. It's not seamless, though. It's certainly not like a modern Formula 1 gearbox where you pull the paddle and you only hear the engine revs drop or rise as the situation may be. There is a considerable clunk on the upshift and the downshift. There's a little bit of a delay there in power transmission. So we have, as RSS have already said about this car, a very interesting blend of technologies. We do have some, by today's standards, relatively rudimentary things such as that gearbox, but we've also got some modern perks like DRS. So this car truly is a very nice blend of old and new, and to be honest with you, I am a Formula 2 fan as well. I will be a little bit sad when Formula 2 calls it quits on this particular chassis, although the 2018 car, it's more so in keeping with the latest design trends in Formula 1. It's certainly going to be a welcome change for the Formula 2 series. Enough on the specifications of this car, however, and of course when we get it out on track a little bit later on, you'll be able to see all of that for yourself. Commentary will be provided, of course. However, what we really need to just take some time to look at here is the absolute quality of this workmanship. When RSS released Formula Hybrid, we were absolutely spellbound at the level of craftsmanship that they were able to squeeze into that car. Formula Hybrid was very unique because when RSS started work on that car around the mid part of 2016, nobody had ever seen a 2017 spec Formula 1 car. And the fact that they were able to be so accurate in their specification, and the fact that it still looks current, even though we're approaching the halfway point in the 2017 Formula 1 season, the fact that RSS were able to really project their mind's eye into the future and predict what these Formula 1 cars were going to look like and iterate that in Formula Hybrid, that really speaks to the amount of know-how and craftsmanship and design foresight that this modding team has. With this car, it's heavily based on a car that already exists and has existed for quite a few years already, but still, the amount of quality that we see in this model from the exterior alone is absolutely staggering. This is right up there with the best of the best for Assetto Corsa, Kunos, and third-party modders included. You can have a look here as the car's just rotating around here in showroom view. Absolutely wonderful. I don't have any gripes whatsoever about the modeling on this thing. Everything looks absolutely perfect. When you get in closer, the details only improve, which is always the mark of something that has been put together extremely well. You can see in this livery, the car is just pretty much bare carbon, not too much paint here in this specification of livery, but that carbon is wonderful to look at. You can see the weave of that carbon resin cloth as it is impregnated into the structures of pretty much everything on the car. I particularly like how you can see how those lines change their thickness as you move closer and farther away from different parts of the car. Looking at the turning vane there, you can see the weave pretty clearly, but then looking at the front section of the tub, essentially it looks smooth at this point. The side pod, you can see some of that weave now coming into view. Absolutely wonderful craftsmanship, wonderful detail work here by RaceSim Studio. I don't think I can heap enough superlatives on the workmanship on this car. It's 100% unreal. Absolutely in love with it. Looking around on the finer details of the rear here, you can see the gearbox casing, absolutely wonderful, as well as a plexiglass cover, it looks like, over those rear dampers over the top of the gearbox. Absolutely great. The rear sections on these GP2 Formula 2 cars are fairly open, as you can see, but there is a little bit of plexiglass buffer there just to keep some debris from flying up between the suspension elements and hitting into the gearbox casing too much. And of course, you don't want debris to hit the exhaust, which you can see exhaust from the center topside, which is an interesting exhaust arrangement, kind of similar to what we see in Formula One nowadays. And of course, you don't want debris to fly then back across the rear wing and then into the path of a car following close behind. So interesting detail there, design-wise, and wonderful detail by RSS to include that. Looking down here, you can get a better sense of the rear end aero treatment. Big diffuser on this car. Very much in keeping of what we were seeing in Formula One about 2009, before the FIA clamped down on the double-decker diffuser regulations. Not quite a double-decker diffuser on this, although I suppose you could say that potentially it is when you look at the top of the floor as it relates to the beam wing here, the bottom element on the rear wing. But absolutely wonderful modding work and modeling work going on here. Great, great, great. Of course, there are many more details to see on this car, and we will do that momentarily. Have a look at the rear wing here. Just press the 0 key on your numpad, and the rear wing pops open. That shows you the DRS flap opening. It will close automatically in a few seconds. Just to give you a sense of how that slop gap opens and closes on the rear wing as you engage or disengage DRS. Very, very cool feature in showroom view. Of course, that opens up while you're on track and you hit the DRS button, but not every car that has DRS has that ability to open and close it in showroom view. Very nice touch. However, the most impressive touch on this car is yet to be seen. If your fingers just happen to wander on over to the spacebar key while you're in showroom view, the following will occur. Yes, 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 your eyes do not deceive you. Blink a few times if you want. Shake your head around. Make sure you're not dreaming. I assure you, you are not dreaming. The car explodes into a whole bunch of its component pieces. The headrest comes off. All 4 wheels come off. All 4 wheel nuts come off. The nose cone and front wing come off. The rear wing end plates come off. The DRS flap opens. Everything, even the turning vanes, they come off. You can see every last detail on this car aside from the engine bay. But have a look at the stuff that you're not even supposed to see and the level of detail that exists in here. You can see the dampers there in the front end of the chassis. Yep, those are the dampers that you're adjusting while you're playing around in the pits, playing with spring rates and ride heights and things like that. There they are. They're modeled. You never see them, but there they are. Unbelievable job. Have a look at the brake detail inside here. You can see those carbon ceramic discs inside those. Looks like we have 4 piston calipers, front and rear, on this car. Wonderful. You can see the slots there cut in the brake rotors for ventilation, of course. Very important to keep these carbon brakes within their optimal operating temperature. And a side note to that, you can see some masking tape over the front end of the brake ducts here, labeled accordingly LF for left front and RF for right front. That's just a little bit of a visual detail there, just showing how you could control the amount of airflow going into those brake ducts so you can control the level of brake cooling to a little bit higher degree of precision. As far as I'm aware so far, your setup changes do not impact the appearance of that tape, but I've never seen that before on an Assetto Corsa mod, and it is a very cool detail indeed. Just more details though here on the front end. You can see these green lines around those bolt holes. That's where the front wing mounts. That's where the quick release catches will be installed and uninstalled to install or uninstall the front nose cone. That detail is there. And also you can see the suspension pickup points, all of the bolts, all of the stays, everything. You can see where the push rods go into the top of the chassis. Absolutely wonderful level of detail. And essentially no pixelation that I can detect to any degree here. I'm just blown away. Absolutely blown away by this. Additionally, you can also see some very cool geometries going into the radiator inlets on the side pods. Just below that, you can see the barge board treatment on this thing. Some interesting jagged serrated edges on the barge boards, not unlike what we had seen on some Formula One cars, particularly Ferraris of yesteryear. And then you have the geometries going into the radiator ducts themselves. You can see there's a little stay there moving from the side of the tub proper to the bottom inside section of the radiator duct. Very cool. I assume that's just to control a little bit of torsion on the side pod itself. And then of course you can see the radiator matrix itself in there. Very nicely detailed. Looking in the midsection of the car, you can see in the cockpit. We'll go in the cockpit in just a couple of seconds here, but you can get a little sneak peek of all of the wonderful detail going on in there. Of course, across the engine cover, you've got a shark fin. That seems pretty ubiquitous in Formula 1 nowadays, and GP2 have been running a shark fin, obviously, since 2011 when this car was introduced. Moving to the rear wing, you can see the end plates have been dismounted, so you can see the wonderful details on the inboard and outboard sides of those end plates, and you can see the rear wing main plane itself. You can see that wonderful shape, that spoon shape. You can see the DRS flap is open at this point. You can see the main support strut that carries the hydraulic pressure from the gearbox to that DRS actuator, and of course provides support for the rear wing and main plane as well. Very cool. Moving across the rear, you can see more detail with the rear suspension. Again, 4 piston calipers on the rear. Inside those carbon ceramic rotors reside. And then you've got that gearbox casing detail a little bit more clearly seen now. The ends of the beam wing there also more clearly rendered. And one thing that I do want to make sure that I mention here, have a look at the dampers. Look at those dampers on top of the gearbox, and I'm going to reassemble the car here and just watch the bell cranks and watch the springs themselves in the dampers. Yeah, the dampers move. The dampers actually move. We're used to seeing suspension components oscillate up and down as the loadings change across the car. That's pretty normal now, but the suspension elements themselves move back and forth as the load comes on and off the car. There are other mods that have done that, but they're very few and far between. So to be able to see that on this car, unbelievable amount of detail. There's that cockpit again. It is absolutely inviting. I think we should probably go inside. What do you think? Yeah, let's do it. In we fly to the cockpit, and you can see all of the glorious detail that's going on inside this car. This is pretty much the eye point from which we'll be driving this machine in a few minutes, so you can start to get your bearings in here. Of course, with the headrest sitting across the front of the cockpit, it's a little bit difficult to see forward. We'll remedy that in a moment, but we are going to use the current state of the car to see some of the details in here a little bit more plainly and a little bit more easily. Of course, you can see that everything is turned off because we're in showroom view, but you can see that on the steering wheel we're going to have plenty of information. We're going to have water temperature, oil temperature, gear, speed, fuel level, our current lap delta, our last lap delta, RPM, shown in 3 different ways. You have those analog bars across the top of the LCD. That's an analog representation of the RPM. Also, you have a digital readout in that box in the upper right that says RPM. In addition to that, you've got shift lights that start off in red, starting from the left side of the shift lights there, and then they turn blue in the last 2 lights to tell you when it's time to upshift. Additionally to that, the 2 lights on the outboard section of that LCD, those are your pit limiter lights, and then you've got 2 other lights that come on. There's one DRS activation light, a green light, that comes on the upper left of the steering wheel when you're in a DRS zone, and then when the DRS is actually open, there will be a second green light, this time on the right side of the steering wheel. So lots of instrumentation in the car, lots of good information that you're going to get. Looking down in the cockpit, you can see that carbon fiber seat, absolutely wonderfully modeled. You can see the 5-point harness. You've got the shoulder belts, the lap belts, the crotch strap, and then of course that center buckle where everything loops into that can be released pretty much instantaneously if the driver needs to get out in a hurry. Absolutely wonderful detail. Along the left-hand side of the bulkhead, you can see a chassis plate. We can't quite get in close enough to read it, but I'm sure it is 100% rendered and would be legible if I had software that could isolate that and blow it up so that we could read it. I assume it says something about RaceSim Studio, Formula RSS 2. In any regard, looking around the other side of the cockpit, the sunlit side, wonderful detail of that carbon fiber weave. And then looking around the back, you can see the hard-mounted part of the tub in that cockpit surround. You can see where the seat belts mount in, the shoulder straps anyway, and then looking up you've got that air snorkel and the T-bar on top that carries the onboard camera. Absolutely wonderful level of detail in this car. We'll put it back together, get the headrest in place, and now you can get a better sense of the sight lines through here. You can see the rear view mirrors. They are mounted in pretty much exactly the place you want them. One note about the rear view mirrors though, and you'll be able to see this from the onboard hot lap footage later on, much later on towards the end of the video, but the glass inside those mirrors is curved. I haven't seen that detail before on an Assetto Corsa mod. Not only though is the glass curved, but the reflection that you see in those mirrors is curved in accordance to the curvature of the glass. So the level of detail on this thing is absolutely staggering. There are features on this car that aren't even on Formula Hybrid when it comes to detail, and the fact that RSS are not afraid to eclipse their previous effort with this car, albeit a very different type of car and it exists for a very different purpose, hats off. Hats off to these guys 100%. The only other project that I know for sure that these guys are working on is a 1978-1979 spec Formula 1 car. Of course, that's going to be a ground effect car. It's mostly going to be modeled, I think, after the Lotus Type 79. We will see that at some point. I don't know when. Hopefully before the end of the year. But if Formula Hybrid and now RSS2 are any indicator, that thing is going to be absolutely diabolical as well with the level of detail. But you can see how the sight lines are going to be. Aside from the mirrors, you can see the tops of the front wheels as you would expect. So you know where you are in this car. Initially, when I first drove it, I was thinking that maybe it looked like I was sitting a little bit too low in here. But to be honest, everything just sort of comes into its own when you're out on track. No problem whatsoever. As we leave the cockpit, the car has the proclivity to rip itself to pieces again, but that is okay because there's just so much detail to see. Looking inside the monocoque there through that top hatch, which has of course been removed, you can see the dampers from the other side, and if you can find the right angle, we'll see if we can find that right angle here. We'll look through the nose cone, we'll morph through it. There are pedals? Are there pedals? I don't know if there are pedals. I can't quite make out if there are actually pedals in there or not, but with the amount of detail that's already on this car, I would not be caught by surprise really to see pedals in there. There's just so much detail in this car. I am just absolutely floored by the workmanship here. If it sounds like I'm just gushing over this thing, it's because, well, I am, and I think you can probably excuse me for so doing, because there's just so much to see just in showroom view alone on this car. But of course, showroom view is not good enough for us. We have to get out there, and we have to drive this thing. And to do that, we are going to take it to my favorite circuit. We're going to take it to Imola and give it a proper thrashing. I will say, it is tricky at the limit. Very tricky at the limit. It's very accessible. It's very easy to start building pace in this car, but once you reach the limit, the car lets you know, and it usually lets you know in big ways. We'll see you at Imola in just a moment.
Welcome to Imola. Before we get out on track, as always, we're going to have a look through the setup screen and show you what's what on the Formula RSS2 in terms of default setup. First off, here on the gear screen, of course, you have your adjustments for that 6-speed semi-automatic sequential gearbox. You have pretty much free adjustment through gears 1 through 6, as well as your final drive ratio. However, your adjustment steps are not quite as numerous as you might expect in some areas. Yes, for gears 1 through 6, you do have quite a number of adjustment steps, but in that final drive ratio, you have two choices. You've got 11/35, and you have 10/35, and you have 10/33. So you've only got two different ratios that you can set as the final drive ratio, and you can see that the top speeds in all gears are affected quite significantly by that adjustment of the final drive ratio. These are your default values, however. On the tire screen, you have a menagerie of tire compounds to choose from. Defaults to soft, but you've got super soft, soft of course, medium, and hard. So you've got 4 tire compounds that you can choose. Your tire pressure adjustments, the default value is 12 psi. However, you can go all the way down to 10, and you can go all the way up to 18. So a rather large window of tire pressure adjustment capability. Fuel level. Big fuel tank in this car. Goes all the way up to 125 liters. It defaults to 30 liters. We'll bring it back to 0 right now just to keep the car quiet. Aerodynamics, your front and rear wing adjustments. Basically, that's all you've got on this thing. You don't have the same sorts of turning vanes and flick-ups that you'd see on a modern Formula 1 car, and of course this is in keeping with what was the Formula 1 specification from 2009 up to 2013. You can adjust the flap angles on the front and rear wings. You do not see those flap angles change visually, however, no matter what you do with your wing adjustment values there. We'll keep them at default values here for the moment. The brakes, brake bias, front to rear, it defaults to 54% to the front, in my experience so far testing, that is still a little bit too heavy toward the rear. It's very easy to lock the rear wheels under heavy braking, so I tend to dial that a bit more forward. Brake power, of course, is the amount of power the brakes have when you get on the pedal. 100% is the default. Drivetrain, your diff settings in power, coast, and preload. I would like a little bit more diff, power, and coast, to be honest. I like a higher value there, again, because the rear tends to lock up a little bit too soon once you get back on the power and you get drive equally distributed to the rear wheels there. It's easy to get into an oversteer moment under power right now. Suspension alignment settings, camber and toe on all four corners, default values, of course. The damper settings here are your bumps, bump stops, bound, rebound, your the strength of the dampers there in both the compression and the extension. Roll, anti-roll bars front and rear, of course. Anti-roll bar on the front is a bit too stiff. I have dialed that out a little bit just to make the front end a little bit more compliant and to cut out a bit of the understeer that this car has in the default setup, and you'll see that in a moment. However, wheel rates and ride heights, travel ranges on all four corners as well. Under various, the only adjustment you have here is steering assist. This is power steering, basically. Defaults to 100. And then, of course, the obligatory pit stop strategy screen, which is ubiquitous now up and down the field in Assetto Corsa. We're going to take this run initially with the default setup just to show you what's going on. We're going to run completely default and the default 30 liters of fuel on board just to give you a little bit of a shakedown and show you how the car behaves with that default setup straight out of the box here, courtesy of RaceSim Studio. You can see here in the cockpit the car is now alive. We've got our display up on the steering wheel. On the left-hand side in that little box we have water temperature, and I think that's air temperature, believe it or not, on the left-hand box in that display. Water temperature ticking up past 70 degrees Celsius, and then air temperature, I think that's ambient air or intake air. Not quite entirely sure why we've got that instrumentation, but there it is, about 32 degrees C, which is right about ambient air temperature. In the center, obviously, you've got a gear display showing neutral right now. It cycles up and down as you go up and down through the box, 6 gears. And of course, reverse as well if you ever need to punch up reverse. Below that, across the bottom of the screen, you've got our speed readout. It'll be reading out in miles per hour to us. To the right of that, the 3 bars you can see, that's your fuel level. Above the fuel level, you've got your current lap time ticking away there next to the letter CL, and it's currently reading 5:40. Below that, you have your last lap time, and then the delta is above the current lap time, so that'll tick up or down, plus or minus, depending on what you're doing relative to the delta. Final bit of instrumentation there on the screen, RPM. We are idling at 2750. And then, of course, you can see that that ticks up and down according to engine RPM. Across the top of the display, you've got an analog tachometer, and then, of course, where you see the 2 flashing lights across the top on either side, that's an indicator that the pit lane speed limiter is active. And then between those, you'll have shift lights that you'll see in a moment. They start ticking up red from left to right, and then they turn blue when you're ready to change up. The green light you can see turned on in the upper left of the steering wheel. That is the DRS activation light, so the DRS is available, and then if I hit the DRS button, the second green light on the right turns on. That shows you the flap is open. We'll close that down for the moment. So as tire pressure and tire temperature fall away here, we will get out on track on default setup and just give you a little shakedown to show you how the default setup appears when you get out of this car, out of the box. So coming onto the racetrack here, we're going to be cautious because, of course, we have no temperature or pressure in the tires and brakes. Let's get up and down through the box a couple of times. Give it some revs. There's full revs. Upshift right at 10,000 RPM. Your first observation, not anything about the car, but you're going to be observing my force feedback. You can see in the lower left where I've got the pedal trace. The bar to the extreme right of that little box is the force feedback trace, and you'll see that through the high-speed corners it's clipping a lot. The reason for that is this car felt a lot, let's say it felt a bit light straight out of the box in terms of my force feedback. So I've dialed up my force feedback quite a bit in this car simply because these cars have very heavy steering in the real world, and initially on my Thrustmaster TSPC the force feedback was not nearly high enough, so I just wanted a little bit more feel in terms of steering weight. I'm sacrificing a little bit of definition through the high-speed corners, but to be honest, it cuts down on extraneous steering wheel motion, which I think is far more realistic anyway. Actually, having driven a real race car now, I can tell you that you do not have the opportunity to juggle the steering very much through the corners, particularly if you don't have power steering. So going for realism there in terms of the steering weight to the expense slightly of steering feel. In any regard, we're starting to get some tire temperature now, starting to get some brake temperature, starting to feel that the car is there for me. And on default setup, how does this thing feel? As you can see, the traction there coming out of the Acqua Minerale section, you've got plenty of rear grip under acceleration. You're not wanting for that. Of course, no traction control or anything on this car, so you do have to be judicious with your throttle input in the beginning. However, once you've got some speed and the downforce starts to build on the rear end, remember you've got that big diffuser at the back as well. Rear traction, you're not wanting for that. Just through these corners here, through the rivazzas, you do have to be careful about the rear end. Into the DRS zone down start finish. We'll pop 6th gear just as we cross the line. And we'll go up to our top speed of about 183 miles per hour, there or thereabout. And then on the brakes, really hard into the Tamburello chicanes. So wonderful noise from that 4-liter Mechachrome engine. Well, don't call it a Mechachrome. It's a Mechachrome lookalike engine. And into the Tosa corner. Car always wants to understeer through Tosa. You just have to be patient getting back on the power. Make sure you stay on line through there. That's where the time is. Piratella. Bit of understeer, bit of oversteer over the curbs there. A little debris out there. To Acqua Minerale, not quite flat on default setup. That will be flat once we dial in my setup so far. I do have to say, I've done more testing in this car than I normally do before a review of a new mod, simply because there was a little bit more that I needed to get my head around before I could find some pace in this thing. We'll go into that once we get into the actual setup that I will be using on this car. See there, accidentally hit one of the buttons associated with energy recovery. No hybrid system, of course, on this car, so you do not have to worry about your harvest and deploy settings for an MGU, for example, or for a KERS unit, simply because it's not there. As RSS have already said with their publication material for this car, it does make for a little bit more pure an experience because you're just concerned about the driving. To the brake, 2nd gear to Tamburello. Get on the power midway through the first element of that chicane. You don't have to worry so much about having the car track wide. You've got plenty of grip through the high-speed sections, as you can see. You can use the curbs all you want in this car. It's very compliant over the curbing. It's not going to spit you off so much, unlike some of its relatives, particularly from yesteryear in Formula 1. The Ferrari F2002 and F2004 are particularly bad when you hit curbs under heavy acceleration. They will spit you off into one of those barriers on the left or right. This, not so much. You've got to respect its limits, of course, but more or less it's happy. It's happy to do what you want. See the default setup, I'm having to modulate my braking pressure a little bit more than I would normally, simply because those fronts are very easy to lock, as are those rears, particularly with the brake bias where it is at 54% to the front. We'll see though, what's our lap time? If I can read it there, those very small numbers. on the steering wheel coming across the line. Lap time of 128, or 129.023. I think it's a 129. I have gone faster in this car. Again on sticky tires and my own setup. We'll dive into the pits at the end of this lap and we'll load it up with what I'm used to in terms of the setup and the fuel load and all that stuff. Still going to run the medium tires for our longer run, and we'll just start to talk about more about the technicalities of the car and how it feels and whatnot. This run, just want to show you how it behaves on default. There's plenty of grip, but you will notice there is a rather significant amount of understeer to the tune of big-time lifts through high-speed corners. And you can see the back end gets a little squirrely there. Bit of rear locking into Variante Alta. Got away with it. You will also trigger downshift protection in this car if you're not careful. Trigger it intentionally. Or not. Sometimes downshift protection does catch you out a little bit, and then you will be pushed wide of the apex, depending, of course, on how quickly you were entering the corner to begin with. Sometimes you'll go off entirely via that downshift protection. So you do just want to be measured with your downshifts. Make sure that you're braking hard enough so that you'll get the retardation as you go down into the next gear. Here we are, recovered to the pits now. And we will just go and load up the setup that I've got on the car. At least where it stands right now. Alright, so we've loaded it up. You've noticed that on my setup I've not done anything with the gearbox. I've kept that at default values because it feels like a very good balance between acceleration and straight line speed down that straight, of course, with DRS available. We're going to run on the medium compound tires because we are going to have a longer run, but you'll see what I've done with the tire pressures. I've lowered them by 2 psi in the front and by 1 psi in the rear. I wanted a little bit more rear traction. It helps a little bit with that rear locking under braking, and then more grip on the front end as well. I wanted to try and dial out some of that understeer that you saw on the earlier run that we just finished. So a little bit more mechanical grip on the front is going to help in the low speed sections. Fuel load, we're going to run 50 liters on this setup. And then for the aerodynamics, we are running full front wing at the moment because I want the aero balance in high-speed corners to favor the front. I like a pointy car, so I'm willing to sacrifice a little bit of straight line speed so I can get more grip into the corners, particularly on initial turn-in. Rear wing, though, we've lowered it by 1 whole number there. Brake bias, I've dialed it initially a bit closer to the front, so brake bias now at 58% to the front. That's going to help with rear locking as well. Brake power remains at 100%. Diff power and coast, I've added more diff power and coast, so 41% on power and coast. The preload is up just by 1 Newton meter. Suspension alignments, I've not touched them because everything feels like it's all in line with itself, so that's fine from default. The dampers, I haven't really touched these either. Again, the car does not feel like it has too much of an aggressive heave moment, so when you're coming up off of the bumps, the car does not bounce or anything like that, and in compression it feels very stable as well. Particularly those of you who saw the video of the comparison between this car and its older brother, Formula Hybrid, you'll see those big bumps going into Stowe Corner at Silverstone. The car handles them very nicely, so I don't really at this time feel any need to do anything with the dampers. The suspension and roll, I have lowered that anti-roll bar in the front a little bit from the default values because it just felt too stiff to me. If the car was bouncing at all, it felt like it was bouncing on turn-in. It wasn't quite biting the circuit the way I wanted, even on the super soft tires. So just a little bit more compliance dialed in across the front axle. No changes to the steering assist, as you might expect. If anything, I want the steering to be as heavy as possible. So that's where we stand right now with the setup that I'm going to run for our longer run. And back in the cockpit, you see everything as it should be. So, heading back out on the circuit for our proper shakedown and test of RSS Formula 2. DRS open. And straight on the power, not going to hesitate at all now. Just got to bring these medium tires up to their optimal working range. They were in the blankets, of course, but that last bit of warm-up has to happen on the circuit. Of course, we got to get temperature in the brakes again as well. Already good traction, not worried about that. And up through the box. 2 downshifts into Piratella, just barely kissed that apex curb, and then you can use a lot of the exit curb. This is not quite flat yet. It may be later on. Of course, we're running quite a bit of fuel on board, so we have to take that into consideration. Down the back straight, initially uphill a little bit, and then we plunge downhill for the Rivazza corners. Bit of front locking there, as you can see, still not quite up to temperature on those front tires. Bit of understeer. Now down start finish, DRS activated and open. Even though we've got more front wing dialed onto the car, straight line speed is really not suffering all that much. Probably because I've taken off a bit of rear wing. That's the bigger culprit in terms of generating drag. And now into Tosa. I feel like the front end is now there for me in terms of temperature and pressures. They'll be up a little bit, of course, as the tire temperatures themselves go up. Air expands when it's heated, remember. So now we can get down to business. How does this car actually feel? What does it do? Is it there for you? And most importantly of all, is it fun? Well, straight out of the box, what you do notice about the car, on default setup we mentioned this, but yes, it is biased a little bit toward understeer, especially on that default setup. So you do have to work a little bit on the setup to dial that understeer out according to your preferences. Aside from that though, equally on default as well as my custom setup here, great rear traction. You're not wanting for rear end grip at all in the traction zone. Sometimes a little bit in the high speed corners if you're really pushing the limit, but for the most part it's very solid. You can get on the power pretty hard straight out of a corner, no problem whatsoever. Engine power feels sufficient for sure. Remember, we're running about 612 horsepower from that 4-liter V8 engine behind us, so it's really enough. It does feel down on power, of course, relative to a Formula 1 car because, well, it's not a Formula 1 car. It is a Formula 1 car's baby brother. If you are used to driving F1 cars, particularly the 2010 through 2013 era, you will definitely feel like this car is underpowered because, well, it is. Even though dimensionally it's very similar to Formula 1 cars of that time period, it is down on power because it's not an F1 car. I think we've made that point already. Gearbox, as I mentioned in showroom view, it is a little bit slower than what you may be used to from the very latest Grand Prix era machinery. However, it's still plenty quick, very positive response times. You do notice a considerable gap in drive. Listen here on the upshifts. There is definitely a noticeable break in power delivery between gears. However, to keep costs down for Formula 2, that is what Dallara designed for this car. I don't know who actually supplies the gearboxes for Formula 2. I think it's Hewland, but don't quote me on that. Of course, they're looking for cost savings. They're looking for reliability as well because Formula 2 teams don't have nearly the budgets as their Formula 1 counterparts, so they want components that are going to be reliable as well as serviceable over their service life. So you sacrifice a little bit in shift times, but that's fine. For this car, for the amount of power it has, it feels very adequate. You do, of course, get an auto cut on the upshifts as well as an auto blip on the downshifts, so there's no stabbing at the throttle as you're braking into the corners. That's all done for you. And as you can see, you can string together 2 or 3 downshifts in a row. No problem. Not going to unsettle the car by doing that. biggest thing that jumps out to me about this car, though, and the biggest problem that I think most of you will have with it, is the steering weight. This is all down to personal preference for the most part. Yes, in a real car like this, the steering is very heavy. However, in terms of sims, it's all dependent on what sort of setup you've got. I'm running a Thrustmaster TSPC Racer. This wheel motor base has the capacity to put out over 100 Newton meters of torque. That's about the same as a 1.5-liter four-cylinder engine. So this thing can put out a lot of torque if you want it to, and it certainly will do so. However, it all comes down to your taste. So if you're running a Thrustmaster or certainly a Fanatic type wheel, yes, you'll be able to dial up that steering weight quite a bit. For those of you who are still running more consumer-grade materials like Logitech, for example, it depends on what the capabilities of your hardware are, and it also depends on what your personal tastes are. I like cars with heavy steering. It's just something that I prefer. If you like to throw the car around a little bit more and make finer adjustments in the corners, you might want to dial back that force feedback. However, you're going to have to run around and see what feels best. Running wide there. One thing I will say about this car, though, because it is built for a feeder series, it does tend to magnify your mistakes. You saw there through the Villeneuve chicane, I ran wide on the exit. That's because I left the downshift into second gear a little bit too late. The revs were not in the right place, so when I used my throttle blip technique to try and get the car to rotate a little bit through the corner, it was too late. The revs were too low on the engine. I didn't have the same sort of power delivery as I would have in second gear at that moment, so I just had a little bit of an off. This car does magnify your errors, however, it also magnifies the things that you do well. I can definitely understand how a driver can really learn how to be a top-level open-wheel racer in a car like this. See a lap time of 1:31. Remember, we are running a lot of fuel on board, and we're on those medium tires. Just love that sound out the back. You'll hear that better, of course, toward the end of the video with the hot laps, but love, love, love that V8 sound. I love a high-revving V8 engine. There's nothing else like it. Late on my turn in there for the first element, got away with it. And down, start, finish. If I sound a little bit subdued driving this car, there's a reason for that. Yes, it is absolutely spectacular. The workmanship, the craftsmanship, the quality is wonderful on this car, and I think we should expect nothing less from the guys at RaceSim Studio. Their work on Formula Hybrid was so good, they really set the bar for third-party mods in Assetto Corsa, and they're continuing to make good on that precedent and to make good on that promise to give us a really wonderful sim racing experience. However, me being a little subdued about this car is not really anything to do with the car. It's nothing to do with RSS, nothing to do with what they have actually done. However, driving this car is a little bit more of an academic experience rather than a passionate one, because that car just magnifies all of your errors. You have to concentrate really hard in this thing to be precise, to be accurate, to be smooth. The old maxim, smooth is fast, is very true in a car like this. It doesn't have the same sort of explosive power that you would expect from a modern Formula One car, particularly when you supplement it with that electrical assistance. But it's an interesting cross between cars of lower formulas like Formula 2000, Formula Ford, Formula 3, where momentum management is more important, and the higher level formulas like, well, Formula 2 and Formula 1. You've got the engine power to help you where you need it, but you also have the chassis dynamics that are a little bit on the purer side, like a Formula Ford, for example. It's a very interesting experience, and because of that, there's a lot to get your head around. The car does some things that you would more so expect to see in Formula Ford. Like, for example, when your line is not quite right, you lose a lot of momentum in this car. Even though you've got that engine power to help you, you're going to be slower if you're not precise. These are the sorts of errors that you can kind of mask when you're driving a much more powerful car. Like Ferrari F2004, for example, you don't have to be inch perfect in that car all the time to put in a really fast lap time because you've got 980 horsepower behind you. This thing, yes, is pretty light, and it's very powerful, but it's just not quite powerful enough to give you something to hide behind. What's our lap time here? 1:29.951, I think. Can't quite read that display. There's that downshift protection, and you can see it pushed me wide at the apex, which then compromises the whole rest of the corner. Same mistake I made a couple of laps ago, left the downshift a little bit too late. You can see everything is magnified in this car. Let's see, we've burned off a fair bit of fuel now. Shall we try the Super Softs? I think we shall. Super Softs for us. Let's see, our session best 129.9 to beat. We'll see if we can best that time. As I mentioned in showroom view as well, the lap delta between this car and Formula Hybrid, it's about 10 seconds over the course of a lap, as you might expect. We'll just very carefully stop in the box. We'll change the tires, and we'll get going. Open that DRS, and back out on the track. Too enthusiastic there on the shifting. Let's be measured with this warm-up. You don't want to rip the new out of these super soft tires too quickly. Just want to bring them up to temperature gradually and then go on it for your first flying lap. Deliberate on the brakes and downshifts. Hard on the power. Now we can start building up. Bit more bite on initial turn-in, as you might expect from a softer tire. In the DRS zone, flaps are open. Pop 6th across the line. And off we go. Full power straight away, it does not complain at all. That's where having a little bit less horsepower is advantageous. Great turn in, absolutely great turn in now. Tosa, get it right down to the apex, don't hit it though, it'll unsettle the car, go out wider on the exit, no problem. 5th gear, up the hill, Piratella, 3rd gear, stay a little wide of those apex curbs, use the exit curbs. 5th gear, diving Aqua Minerale, is it flat? Not quite. On the power. Bouncing off of those exit curbs. Love it. Love it. On the brakes. Variante Alta. Hit the first one. Hit the second one. Get on the power slowly now. 5th gear. Wind it out in 5th. Braking for Rivazza. A little bit of rear locking still. Got away with it. Use those exit curbs all you want. DRS. What's the time? What's the time? 1:28.091. Haha, little twitchy there. The red mist is coming down, boys. Power, yes. Make it flat. Oh, just barely not. Caught some oversteer across the second apex there. We're going to lose all of our momentum. $128.193. Not bad, not bad. Oh yeah, a little bit of oversteer under power, and there's the fuel light coming on. Tires are now past their prime, still trying to go for it. Can we make it flat? No, not quite. I don't know if it's just not quite in the setup or if it's just not quite in my testicular fortitude at the moment, but not quite flat. Try not to catch oversteer. We didn't. On the power. Good. A little wide. That hurt us in the traction zone. Still got 4/10 on the delta. The negative direction. Hit that apex. Hit that apex. On the power. Hard. Between the two corners. Hit the second apex. Nice. Get on that power. Yes. Use all of the exit road. Keep as tight in as you dare. Across the line. 127.743. That's a lap record for me. Yes. Oh, yeah, really going for it. Upshifting in midair there, essentially. The first apex and the second apex. Try to keep it inside the white line. Still gaining some time, that's good. We're talking about fractions of fractions now. Get that apex, get on the power, on the power. Get that second apex, on the power. Use the exit curb. DRS open. Use the green road there. Use the green road across start finish, and the time is 1:27.649. We're almost out of fuel. We're going to back it down a little bit because I think that's as much as the car is going to do with this setup, with this driver. All in all, what is this car? Well, it's exactly what it claims to be. It is a very, very high fidelity replica in the virtual world of a 2011 through 2017 spec FIA Formula 2 car. So nicely done. The car's behavior, absolutely believable. The detail of everything from a visual standpoint, as we saw in showroom view, it's to die for. Everything in here looks absolutely resplendent. All the sizes and locations, shapes of everything look very, very appropriate. I love it, love it, love it. For €5.99 over on the RaceSim Studio website, you too can have the experience of driving this car. I very highly recommend it, and of course, do support the guys over at RaceSim Studio because they do wonderful work like this, and they do not ask all that much from all of us for the privilege of enjoying the fruits of their labor. It is an absolutely wonderful experience all around. You all absolutely must try this car. It's wonderful. Absolutely wonderful in every regard. There you go. You can see we've picked up a little bit of dirt on the front end of the car there, pounding around on the circuit, going slightly off on a couple of occasions. It's wonderful. Absolutely wonderful driving experience, and that modeling, as we mentioned in showroom view, just look at it. It's like looking at a photograph taken with one of those really, really high megapixel cameras that they use for advertising and things like that. But this is a computer model that you can enjoy at home. And of course it's interactive and you can drive the thing. Wonderful bit of craftsmanship over at RaceSim Studio, courtesy of those guys. Absolutely wonderful work. I love it to death. Absolutely, I love it to death. This car has, I think, a lot of replay value as well. It's not as fast as Formula Hybrid. If you're trying to drive the fastest thing out there, no, this is not it by any means. But if you want a very pure, a very rewarding driving experience, and also if you want a driving experience that's educational in a lot of regards, that's also this car. Because as I said out on track, it magnifies your mistakes and it also magnifies your talents. So at once it's flattering as well as insulting. So that is how I would characterize Formula RSS 2 by RaceSim Studio. You will learn so much in this car. I think this is going to be very popular in league racing, online lobbies, things like that, but also just popular with guys like me who just like to do hot laps and just like to enjoy these cars in isolation, figure out how they work, and figure out how to be better drivers while so doing. If I had to teach somebody how to drive an open-wheeled car in sim racing, this is what I would use. This is what I would use, because you've got to be precise, you have to understand what the car can and cannot do, and also you can't be afraid to push it a little bit too, as you saw in our last run there on the super soft tires. The car will be there for you, but you have to be aware of its capabilities and respect its capabilities. Aside from all of that, though, I would like to thank all of you very much for sticking with me through this lengthy review piece of this wonderful car. I know a lot of you have been waiting for it, and I've been waiting to do it as well. I do work a lot. For those of you who don't know, I'm a teacher. I teach English to new immigrants to the United States, and it's a very rewarding job. However, it does require a lot of time commitment from me. But be that as it may, when I do have the chance to do so, I absolutely love making these review videos as well, and I know all of you absolutely love enjoying them. So do come back, keep coming to the channel. I love it. I love the interaction with all of you, and of course, like, comment, subscribe. I love to hear from all of you. I love to hear your observations and your suggestions, and of course the kind words of encouragement that you all give to me. I love every minute of it. I try to respond to as many comments as I can, but do be aware I do have a life outside of this, and it is rather time-consuming. But I wouldn't change either way for the world. However, as far as this video goes, that's it for the review piece. Do stay tuned, however, for, as always, the hot laps to come without commentary from external as well as onboard views. Until next time, though, stay tuned for the hot laps. Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you very, very much for watching, and we will see you soon.